You're watching The New Stack Makers, a podcast for people who develop, deploy, and manage at-scale software. For more information and articles about at-scale technologies, please visit thenewstack.io. Now enjoy the show.
PagerDuty is transforming critical work for modern enterprises. With the PagerDuty Operations Cloud, organizations can compress costs, accelerate productivity, and sustain seamless digital experiences. Modern enterprises trust PagerDuty for the management of digital operations, including incident response, AI ops, process automation, and customer service operations.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The New Stack Makers. I'm your host, Heather Joslyn, features editor of The New Stack, and today we're going to talk about automation, AI, and how they can help organizations deal with incident management and how all of this plays into operational resilience. We'll be joined for this discussion by Dormain Drewitz, Vice President of Platform Advocacy at PagerDuty. Hi, Dormain.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us. Dormain, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what PagerDuty does?
Absolutely. I have been at PagerDuty for a couple of years now. I lead our developer relations and advocacy teams. And PagerDuty is an end-to-end platform to help organizations deal with the unexpected incidents and unplanned work faster and more efficiently. So that frees up their team's time for innovation, helps reduce costs. But I think what we're really known for is helping to deal with that risk of operational failure. So sometimes I think of it as, how do you go from data to doing something about it to done?
Well, that's a good place for us to start. Just to make sure that our listeners are on the same page as we are in this conversation, how do you define operational resiliency?
I have to admit, I don't think I've written down a definition that's, ready to get tattooed anywhere. I was having a great conversation with Sam Newman a couple weeks ago where he was citing the Chumbawamba song of "I get knocked down, but I get up again." Mm-hmm. And so that, the resiliency is, I think it's about having the ability to bounce back and recover. But it is, I think, to Sam's point, it's more than just a sort of technical backup and recovery type of conversation. It has to also manifest in that organizational recovery. And so, the culture and psychological safety that goes along with that means that you are willing and able and confident enough to take risks. And that is something that, we certainly see our customers able to get more comfortable and confident with, but then also know that you are able to deal with issues when they arise, and you don't let that stop you from still trying to move fast.
I just wanted to annotate too. So Sam Newman is a consultant in the UK who's also written some O'Reilly books. He's very kind of a guru of the cloud native world. And psychological safety, which you mentioned as well, that's, often comes into play when you have an incident that you have to find, you have to find out the reason. And it means how do you, I have a definition for it, but how would you define it? Psychological safety.
Again, not something that I've sat down and written to the tattoo level. Mm-hmm. But that comfort level to be able to take risks where you have that interpersonal trust with your teams and also with leadership in the organization, to the extent that you are able to, whether it's speaking up about something or knowing that, well, let's try it and see what happens. And we have the confidence in ourselves and our systems, but also the confidence in our leadership to know that we're able to take these types of risks, knowing that sometimes they will pan out in amazing ways, and sometimes they won't. So, but you'll never know, and you'll never be able to kind of learn and grow if you don't take those risks. I was having a fun chat with a former colleague recently about some of the psychological safety sort of learnings from, shows like everything from Ted Lasso to, I don't know if you watched Chernobyl, which
on HBO. Yes. I actually once had a conversation with a colleague about how it showed the dangers of not having psychological safety.
Yeah.
In
I
it.
still have notes in my iPhone from when I was watching that, and I was taking notes about this is such a wonderful illustration of just the catastrophic outcomes that can occur
Mhm.
when no one felt confident to be able to question what was going on. And then, of course, that meant that they didn't actually have confidence in a lot of their systems, or when they were trying to follow through with those procedures, their leadership didn't have confidence in what the engineers on the ground were trying to communicate.
So basically, if you're afraid to speak up because you're afraid you'll be punished, you might wind up in a Chernobyl type situation,
Yeah, I mean, that's
or,
maybe a bit
or
extreme,
the
but
equivalent for your organization, a very
yeah.
bad situation for your organization. So recently in the news tech, you wrote about how we often talk about automation and AI in terms of how it can boost developers' productivity, but if developers are producing more code, you wrote, what impact does that have on platform teams, SREs? Network operations center staffs. My question is, what can automation coupled with AI do to improve the productivity of all those people on the team who aren't front end developers?
Yeah, this is that kind of squeezing the balloon problem, and I honestly I think, like, this is not a new topic when you think about DevOps and all the examples of, like, yeah, throwing code over the wall,
Hmm.
but we face a test in our maturity around DevOps when suddenly you're going to give the people throwing things over the wall, so to speak,
Hmm.
if they've got a forklift and they're throwing more, right?
Hmm.
So it will really, I think, test and strain those organizations around, they say they're doing DevOps, but how much have they really empowered their doesn't mean that everyone is doing everything, but those platform teams, which are there to really help scale a lot of those operational processes, touching everything from the infrastructure up to that code level. And also, what have you done to make sure that your development teams are accountable and are able to take action? Some of the challenges that have cropped up, right, that organizations have been dealing with. Sure, the internet startups having developers own the kind of full stack, that's one thing. They,
Hmm.
maybe they can do that. It's a huge cognitive overhead for those teams. And so right there, you've had a reason to think about how could we offload from our developers so that if they're going to be accountable for the code that they ship, it doesn't mean that they have to know the ins and outs of everything from the firewall to the backup software, right? Like, those are
Right.
things that they shouldn't, like, that just adds a lot onto their plate. um, and then, as you saw, organizations in more regulated industries trying to adopt these, they would run into, well, we actually can't. We have separation of duties, and so we can't allow developers to be reaching into a production environment
Hmm.
and mucking around in there because they're trying to do the right thing to um, improve the performance of their code or what have you, but they literally aren't allowed to have the keys to that. And so this is something where automation can help, right? Because you're not having to then say, well, we don't have the training or the access, so we're just going to have to go interrupt, and we're back to the same throwing it over the wall problem.
Hmm.
So how do we use automation to provide access to different systems, where we can wrap the run books and the knowledge and the credentials, so that those things don't have to be transferred to these other teams, namely development teams.
Hmm.
Um, but they also don't have to be put into the backlog of an operations team or a production environment team that's trying to support lots of different development teams, right? That's
Hmm.
they don't need more in their backlog.
Yeah.
And so, platform engineering being a great sort of space around actually doing the work to build a system that can support all these development teams, meet their needs, but also scale. You can only really achieve that with automation. And so as we accelerate with things like generative AI and Copilot and Code Whisper and Code whatever, right? We're putting booster packs on our development teams in a way, which is awesome.
Yeah.
And improving productivity. How do we make sure that that's not going to squeeze the balloon and the other side is going to pop? So this kind of comes back to the automation, the governance that's in place for code once it's in production, and how do you all the operational concerns that go along with that. And so that's kind of a baseline, but then thinking about, well, gee, how can those teams also benefit from not just automation, but AI? And so, the AI side is also at some level, it's a data question. And, we've had more like deterministic models, forms of AI that kind of are able to crunch a lot of data on behalf of those centralized teams, right? That can get flooded with a lot of different moving pieces that are all have their own bells and whistles going off, particularly in really complex environments. And so, some people don't love the term AI ops because, especially, when it gets conflated with something like we literally have the robots running everything and it's a lights out situation, as opposed to, and I can see why that would be really troubling, to sort of think that that's what you're trying to achieve with it. So setting the term aside, it's just the idea of like, how can you use data analytics, machine learning to help those teams get their job done, right? Help them cut through the noise, and have the benefit of that statistical analysis. And then generative AI, which, I mean, in this case, I'm thinking a lot about like large language models, where it's just a different shape of data. And so some of the places that we've been looking at PagerDuty is summarization. So teams that are trying to learn from incidents, and they're trying to manage the communications around incidents. And this is a summarization problem. And so this is an opportunity it's not like a radical gonna transform how everything gets done, but you can hone in on a very particular moment in time in the value chain of incident management, and pluck out these moments where, this is a place that would benefit from deterministic AI because it's a quantitative data problem.
What role do you see for AI-driven automation in terms of handling incidents?
Yeah, I think when you look at that end-to-end value chain during an incident, you have these moments that can benefit from from AI and automation in a couple different places. And so, building on kind of what we were just discussing in terms of the squeezing of the balloon, and thinking about what happens after things get shipped to production and the teams that are involved there. Where are those moments for summarization using large language models? Where are there moments for the sort of deterministic analysis in order to try to identify what could be the root cause here? And those are some places where more of the AI side and automation can also, that's where you're looking at the jobs to be done. And anything that's like, this is going to be the job to be done every time, it's an opportunity to automate. And so whether that's, when you see this type of behavior, go close that port. You see this, go check the diagnostics here. Check if the database is loading. Check if, what's happening with the firewall or the load balancer. Also verify that the, API is responding, right? Like the order of operations, a lot of things, looking at standard Kubernetes troubleshooting is like step one is the Cube API responding, because
Mm-hmm.
nothing you're going to do after that is going to matter. So all of those types of really basic tasks and steps that are going to be used again and again in an incident scenario, those are all opportunities to automate, because those are they're small, but they add up in terms of the blast radius from a interruption and productivity loss perspective. The blast radius of an incident touches all these different teams who get pulled in to just answer those questions, and verify the parts and pieces that they're closer to. They have the training, they have the access.
Mm-hmm.
Coming back to that kind of separations of concern question that we talked about before. So those are some of the places certainly where automation fits in. And then, yeah, I mentioned summarization. And then finally, like code generation is probably like you're not necessarily, you may not be writing a lot of code during an incident because you're trying to restore the service. That's your top priority.
Mm-hmm.
Going back and figuring out like, well, here's where we may need to restructure that code or refactor something. Or we have an opportunity is like, hey, we want to have a run book ready for how do we automate this, the restoration of that service. That's all the kind of follow-on activity. And I think it's really hard when folks have just kind of come through an incident and they're sort of wiping the blood, sweat, and tears off to think about, okay, great, let's go fix the code and write the code that we need to make this better next time. And yet that's also the mindset you need to have so that you're not reliving the same nightmare over and over again.
Yeah.
And so, generative AI can help there as well. So we're adding that in terms of creating those run books. But when you get into the details of the specific code, I imagine there's also opportunities there. But again, it's sort of after the aftermath of the incident and not so much the incident itself.
How is PagerDuty using AI to help organizations manage incidents more effectively?
Yeah, so it's at a lot of those points along the incident value chain.
Okay.
So there's the deterministic AI in looking at the huge volume of event data, right? We've seen over the years is folks set up PagerDuty and they start sending alerts and event data from their monitoring system and observability systems, and they tend to have a collection of those running. And that's partially a reflection of the complex architectures that they have. And the Kubernetes team might be looking at a certain set of monitors and dashboards, and the individual application teams might have something else that they're using. And yet, when something goes wrong, you need to correlate what's happening across those. And then you look at change events, things like, what's happening out of your CI/CD systems. And that's a hugely valuable data source. It's one of my kind of tips that I'm sharing a lot with customers right now is like, hey, the secrets of successful PagerDuty users are how do you make sure that you're connecting in those CI/CD platforms and listening to change events so that they're right there at the fingertips of responders. And so anyways, that's sort of where our deterministic AI is at work to do that correlation, suppressing things that don't need to be, no one needs to get woken up for that.
Yeah.
All of these pieces are related. Here's recent change events and related incidents, past incidents, to contextualize what's happening for a responder. And then we keep kind of enhancing that in various ways. But we've also added the generative AI pieces around status updates. So when you're in the midst of an incident, we had customers who were telling us about how in a major incident, right, when there's a lot of people involved, they'll have up to 3 people dedicated to writing those status updates. Because the teams, the engineers who are heads down trying to restore the service and resolve the issue, you don't want to take them out of that flow. And so, guidelines having like, okay, you have a scribe and you have an incident commander, having someone who's writing up those status updates that can go out to different stakeholders who this might affect another service that another team has, or executives who want to know. Well, there's a big cognitive load in how do I digest and synthesize all of this information of everything that's going on every 15 minutes, every 20 minutes, whatever your protocol is.
Yeah.
And so it becomes a lot of people having to just focus on that. This is where we've added generative AI. You basically kind of push the magic wand button and it'll draft it for you. And so you still get to look over and say, yes, that looks right, or I would change that here, but not having that blinking cursor when you're in the midst of an incident.
Yeah.
It's a high stress situation is valuable for folks. And then the second place is kind of at the end, right? An incident postmortem is, it is in the SRE, handbook. It's the sort of the tome. It tells you thou shalt write a postmortem. And yet that's, that can be, it can take time to go back and do that. Go back and relive this battle we just fought and write it down. And if you pause and come back to it, then you may not have everything kind of fresh in your mind anymore. So how do you help people in that situation? So this is something we've added in as well, kind of the magic button, just generate a draft. And it's so much easier to review and edit and approve something that's been drafted than, have to be like starting from scratch. And so that's something that we think teams are going to get a lot of value from in order to be able to better learn from their incidents by just getting some help in writing up that incident review.
It does seem like that would be very useful at a time when, especially immediately after an incident. I thank Dormain Drewitz of PagerDuty for being with us today. Thank you, Dormain.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Heather.
And we'd also like to thank PagerDuty for sponsoring today's conversation. And we'd like to thank all of you for joining us. This has been Heather Joslyn for the New Stack Makers. We'll see you next time.
If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, you can always subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're on all the major social media platforms. You can always find us at thenewstack.io. We hope to see you soon.